Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi Achint. Today's story time. We need to know about stories of our Indian Armed Forces as well. This is a story of a sailboat that sailed across the world more than 380 plus days by a group of men who were on an adventure more than anything else and a life experience. I have someone with me who was part of this particular mission, particular adventure, or particular journey, as you'd like to term it. Rear Admiral Mukul Asthana, sir, thank you so much for coming on to the show once again. It's a pleasure to have you on Dev Talks for the second time, telling the story of INS Tarangini and its voyage around the world. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you once again to be with you. It's a great pleasure. And I'm very happy to be sharing about INS Tarangini, the Navy's first sail training ship. Today we have two of them. And I was very privileged and honored to be part of two of our voyages. The first was the circumnavigation voyage that I skippered. And the second one was taking her to Europe and bringing her back to India.
I must say, a long distance. So, how come this particular plan of going around the globe? I mean, that's something which is, of course, not. It's an adventure, yes, but it's also dangerous. It's also, uh, it requires a lot of planning, a lot of effort, and in a sailboat, uh, you know, in today's day and age, you look at whose motor is the biggest and whose propulsion system is the best, and you're talking about taking going back to the tradition of sailing. How did you get associated with this particular thing, sir, and how did this whole thing open out? Why, if I may?
So I think it's a very apt question, Adi, but I must say that the Indian Navy and the Navy's training is all about high adventure. And the Navy endeavors at every quarters to provide excellent grooming and training to their cadets and officer trainees and the men. In this case, this is uh, the first long distance circumnavigation voyage any naval ship had undertaken. So this was in the year 2003, 2004. The Navy decided to send INS Tarangini, which is her sail training ship, about 550 tons, which actually is heavier than many of the small corvettes and small forward ships of the Indian Navy. The Navy decided to send her out around the world, across all oceans, across all continents. And that took about 15 months. And I was privileged to skipper the ship from Australia and back to India, at the end of which we had our Honorable President, Dr. Abdul Kalam, who embarked on board just outside Cochin Harbour. And with him, we culminated our 15-month voyage. The ship touched almost about 26 to 28 ports in that voyage, and we turned around the cadets every month and a half. So, in the process, 198 or 200 cadets were trained in different waters of the world. They got exposed to transnational, multicultural exposure for them. We had many foreign trainees with us. So there was a very transnational experience on board for them. And they met many visitors, they met many dignitaries. A lot of visitors came on board. And the whole aim of the Navy was to build bridges of friendship across the seas. And INS Tarani was the most suitable tool for that.
So,
Adi,
I mean,
the second voyage
sir,
undertaken was next year when the Navy decided to send the ship to attend some of the sail festivals in Europe. And this voyage lasted about 6.5 months. I was again privileged to be on board. And we sailed via some of the African ports, the Suez Canal, Mediterranean, into Europe in the North Sea and the Celtic Sea to Ireland, all the way up to Norway, and then we set our course back. Again, we had 16 foreign trainees, and in this voyage too, some 198 cadets were trained. and we touched 16 ports.
Mm, amazing. Had to be an adventure of a lifetime. So, if I may, I mean that's something at a lighter note. But so in today's era, where you're as I kind of hinted on in the opening, navies are talking about propulsion systems. Navies are talking about air-breathing engines underwater, APIs, and this and that, nuclear propulsion, which can go on and on forever. Why going back to the tradition of sailing? Of course, it's a lot of fun for a lot of people. People do it as a hobby. What is the importance of sail trainings in today's day and age?
So a very good question, Adi, and very very proper for you to think as to why go back the olden ways of sailing, when today we have some of the most modern ships. But herein lies the answer that whilst today we have cutting edge technology on board and we have excellently well trained officers, for that matter, we take engineers to be our executive officers, and those who are ex NDA and ex Naval Academy, they are also trained to become electrical officers. They get the BTEC degree, so they have a strong, scientific engineering foundation to handle the various modern technology systems on board the ship. But the fact remains that a ship at sea has to battle and withstand rigors of the elements, the sea, the wave, the wind, and to my mind, the best way to learn the elements is to serve on a sailing ship, because that is where all the very basics are applied. You sail the ship with the help of canvas, with the help of ropes, and you have, although there are engines, there are diesel alternators, but they are used to the minimum. And this is where cadets and officer trainees and men actually get to work with their own hands. And I must say that what they learn on a sailing ship is something which is very unique, and what it develops in them is a huge, quantum of certain qualities which are greatly desirable in a naval officer. And these are some of the time-honored values of camaraderie, teamwork, respect, and loyalty for each other, as well as what they are able to foster in themselves is to have huge respect for the sea and elements. And this is where they actually learn ropes. This is a facet which most navies, most advanced navies have recognized, and hence they have one or two, or sometimes even more, sailing ships in their inventory. And it is mandatory for cadets and officer trainees to spend some time on these ships. Having realized this, Indian Navy also went in for the sail training ship Tarangini in the year 1997. It's now been 26 years. And having seen the great success it has had in terms of training our cadets, it was almost about 10 or 12 years later when the Navy had its second sailing ship called INS Sudarshini. So I'm happy to say that today Indian Navy has two sailing ships, the Tarangini and the Sudarshini. I hope that answers.
That's the whole thing. So when I mean, you mentioned that some of the world's navies. Now, I want to ask you a kind of a question that will gauge one navy against the other. First of all, how many of the world's navies, the largest navies in the world today, use this way of training, method of training, if I may? And amongst them, of course, the focus. I'll just take a little bit of geopolitics into it. The focus, of course, China. Does China do this kind of thing to get the basics into their soldiers? So, and what are the advantages that you see when you kind of train like this?
Okay, so Adi, there are I think other than the Royal Navy, for some reason, who have not gone for sail training ship, every other navy, which includes the Dutch, the Swede, the Swedish Navy, the French, the Germans, U.S. Navy train their officers in their Coast Guard ship Eagle. The Portuguese Navy, the Italians, they all have tall ships, as the sailing ships are called. They have tall ships, and the cadets spend the mandatory time on board there. But when you come to the east, we have in Indonesia and Malaysia, we have tall ships. Um, of late, Pakistan has bought a sail training ship recently from UK. It was called Prince William earlier, and Naharwar is the ship which Pakistan Navy uses. And I'm sure they would have thought that Indian Navy has got two ships. Why should they not be also have? And closer home in Oman, we have a sailing ship called Shabab Oman, who do the sail training on this. As I said earlier, that some of the very basic ropes, the love and respect for the sea, young trainee learns and earns on board a sailing ship. So that's why I think these sailing ships are invaluable, and what they can teach is is a very strong foundation on which everything else to be a good naval officer can be laid upon and made into a very strong, good edifice.
So the two world voyages. Now these are interesting. I mean, you really got to know where the winds are, if I may. As a layman, of course, I have not done this at all, but you really need to know where the winds are and how you can actually avoid the storms, if I may. Can you tell us how this? I mean, it's a large distance to cover. I'm sure 384, 85 odd days. How did you plan? What were the difficulties? What came out of it at the end of it? And were there any memorable incidents that happened where you would say, okay, this was funny, or this was dangerous, or this was something that we could have avoided, or something that we should have experienced and everybody must experience?
So, Adi, I think I must mention here that great detail of planning and logistic support was undertaken before undertaking these two voyages, and great amount of work was conducted at naval headquarters and also at the command headquarters level and at the ship level also. The details of what routes to follow, what weather to expect, and what supports that you expected en route at various ports were discussed with our embassies and high commissions en route, uh, where all our trainees will be changed around, and the foreign trainees from which countries will embark us and disembark us where at every port was also discussed. In case of any medical emergencies, the contingency plans were worked out, your requirement of rations were worked out. It's a very detailed planning, I have to say. And in the second voyage, especially, since I was part of the planning aspects too, I was privileged to be active participant in terms of planning and as to where the ship might carry out refit, etc. That is the repairs and refit after almost about 3-4 months of operational sailing. And there were also some, given certainties which had to be factored. For example, the ship had to participate in some of the sail training events, which are international events. For example, the ASTA sailing competitions races in the Great Lakes in America, and also the festivals and races that we had in Europe, from Ireland to France, and later from England to Norway, as well as attending the bicentenary year of bicentenary celebrations of the Battle of Trafalgar uh, at UK in Portsmouth. So these were the given factors, and along that we worked and we decided that this is how we need to plan our passage, our voyage. This is how it will take so many days. Where all to pick up our rations, where all to disembark our cadets and embark our trainees. So this is how the entire planning was done, and it was a great pleasure to finally be able to execute it. Yeah.
So tell us about the ship. I mean, we were talking offline, and you hinted towards the fact that this is a larger ship than some destroyers. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
And what kind of a? I mean, of course, sailing boats and sailing ships are not supposed to be that big, if I may, and that heavy. What kind of an advantage did it give to the trainees, as you mentioned, uh, especially with the voyage around the world? I mean, they would have really got a lot of sailing confidence.
Yes. So, Adi, I must say that this is a sail training ship. Some people do confuse it to be a boat because it has sails. Well, it's a sailing ship, as the sailing ship used to be in the olden days. And to say the least, she's about 530 tons. She displaces 530 tons in the water. Whereas some of the smaller ships, especially the small missile corvettes and missile boats, touch only about 400 odd tons. So she's a heavy ship for that matter. And what you see above the water actually is only one third, and two thirds is below the water line. And it carries about, Tarani carries 20 sails. There are some 50 lengths of ropes which are required to handle these 20 sails. And when you have to turn the ship uh, in any direction, you require almost 50 men on deck, which include the men and the cadets, and you have to give very precise words of commands, very precise orders to be able to execute things one by one by one, and make the ship turn, as we call in the seaman term, we call it veering or jibing of the ship. So it's a very greatly well tuned activity. It's like a poetry when it happens really. And the crew, the officers, the crew, and the cadets, by and by, you get to learn and become better at it.
Sir, you mentioned about the size and the number of people. That's really amazing because that kind of effort which is needed to just turn the ship, and I'm sure it's a great experience to go through, and it's quite precise because you're dealing with not with computers, but you're dealing with human beings who do make mistakes. So there's a huge opportunity and a huge gap in terms of human reaction sometimes. So it's also a challenging thing to make sure everybody's doing the right thing. I wonder how the forefathers used to do this, and it's a very interesting thought, and it's amazing that our country is still doing things like this. So, how many sailing ships are there in the world, sir? And I'm also aware that the Americans have this ship, I think from the 1800s, that they still maintain, which is it's part of their old navy that they still maintain. Does India also have a tradition like this of maintaining one of their old ships or something like that? And how many sailing ships are there in the world? What is India's plan in the future, sir?
Well, there are almost 100 tall ships in the world that sail today. And I was privileged to have seen about 30, 35 of them in Europe in the year 2005 when I attended those sail festivals. And out of these 100, about 17 or 18 belong to the world navies. So that perhaps answers the question as to why the navies. It's a we answered in the previous question as to why navies resort to sail training in this modern era and age. Uh, some of the largest ships are actually quite heavy. They are almost 1,500 tons, which is almost two and a half size, two and a half times the size of Tarangini and Sudarshini that we have. And this tradition is very well kept alive in European waters, in Europe and in US. In fact, USS Constitution is one of the oldest ships in US which is still afloat. And interestingly, in UK, HMS Victory, which was the ship of Lord Nelson when the Nelson won the Battle of Trafalgar, and of course, in the process, he also made the supreme sacrifice. That ship, HMS Victory, is still preserved as a commissioned ship in Portsmouth. In fact, she's today the flagship of the Flag Officer Home Fleet, which is based at Portsmouth. And very interestingly, Adi, there is a ship called HMS Trincomalee. Now, Trincomalee was a ship that was built by the Vadias in India. And that ship, almost about more than 200 years ago, and that ship is still afloat, although it is grouted, but it is in wet basin in a place called Hartlepool on the east coast of UK. And somehow the Britishers have got a extremely good tradition of preserving their history and nautical history, being an island nation. And they are extremely fierce and proud in terms of safeguarding and maintaining and preserving their history.
I didn't actually know that there was a ship made by the Wadias that old, and I'm in Karnataka. I mean, I should be knowing that. Sir, it's now story time. You gotta tell us some stories of what happened during the ships. Any memorable, funny incidents, any dangerous incidents where you had to take some evasive maneuvers, anything that can actually excite other viewers watching in. Because at the end of it, it's all about the stories that stay along, and the tradition, of course, is all about the stories that people tell.
Yes, Adi, in fact, I must mention that Tarangini did provide a lot many such opportunities. After all, 380 days at sea, 40,000 miles is a long, long time and a long, long distance to traverse, and great many things can happen during the passage, as they did in my time too. And well, I can only recall a few of them for you here. Of course, on the high side, it is a great privilege, I must say, to be able to dine with the Queen of England and Duke of Edinburgh in Portsmouth. We also were selected. Tarangini was selected to be a part of the seven-ship column, a sailing ship column that sailed past the Queen's yacht in Portsmouth in the harbour of Portsmouth, which is called Lee upon Solent, and there were a great number of visitors in this voyage to Europe. I think there were more than 60,000 visitors who came on the ship, and the ship virtually used to swarm and crawl with people. And of course, my very worthy officers and eager cadets were always there to show them around the place. And Tarangi was actually a great ambassador for Indian Navy and for the nation. And some of the interesting bad weathers that we saw, there were extremely bad weather. We encountered once in Mediterranean. We had just cast off from Tunis, that's a port city in Tunisia, and we headed for Lisbon. And this was perhaps the only time that the bad weather did not allow us to make good ports ETA, next ports ETA on time, and we were delayed by one full day. But then we had extremely strong 65 knots, almost about 100 kmph winds from the east, from the west, coming from Atlantic, and there were very heavy seas. I had to run both my engines to ensure that ship sails through. And at that time, in fact, the only concern, anxiety, and fear was that one of the two engines should not give up, because then there was a very strong chance for the ship to approach to and founder. Well, God was with us, I must say. There were a lot of assistance from our embassy in Italy and Spain. They launched a Spanish ship at the behest of our defense attaché at Italy to come overhead in the next day morning and ask as to how the ship was doing. We were doing pretty well, I must say. It was a 3 day long bad weather, which I don't think anybody on the ship would have even got 40 wings at that time. But as, after every storm, there's a clear weather, and that's what we got. Next time we had bad weather was in the Bay of Biscay, which is a part of Atlantic just west of France, and it is perpetually always rough. So that's no surprise. And the third bad weather we had was in the North Sea after we cast off from Newcastle in UK, and we were racing towards Fredrikstad, which is in Norway. It's a distance of about 600 nautical miles. Now, North Sea is a very shallow sea of 25, 28 meters depth. And as you go towards the north of England, there is very unchecked waters all the way from Canada and North America that comes from 2,500 miles away, and there is no barrier to that since you already crossed the northern part of England. So the weather really gets very rough, and being a shallow sea, it develops into a very heavy short sea for that matter. So I remember there were 84 or 85 ships that were taking part, and I think half of them they fell back to either go to Belgium or Germany. But true to our traditions of Indian Navy, we continued with some other ships. And I recall there was this British ship called New Excelsior. She was in distress, and she was taking in some water, and her pumps were not working. So he said, "Okay, fine, we will sail along with you. Whilst we can't help you come close to you because of the bad weather, but we will stand by with you. And that I think happened for almost about a day or so, and before weather improved and we continued to Norway. And that was as far as weather is concerned. We've had machinery failures on occasions. In fact, I remember once I was casting off from Muscat, and my engineer came running to the bridge after we left the harbour. He said, "Sir, we have to stop the starboard engine." Starboard engine is the right engine. I said, "Why? What happened?" He said, "Sir, we got a shaft problem and we just have to shut down." So, well, we did that, and the port of Kochi was still about 1,700 miles away from Muscat. So we decided to sail along on just the sails with only one engine in availability, and we did that. So that was another very interesting incident. Uh, You'll be surprised that there was a time on board Tarangini when both my engines quit. And this happened when we had, I think, 8 or maybe 10 foreign trainees from IOR region. And we had taken them from Cochin to Lakshadweep, all the way up to Porbandar, and via Karwar and Bangalore, we were to come back to Kochi after a period of, I think, 16, 17 days. This is something which the Navy keeps doing. We keep taking foreign trainees for goodwill, to develop friendship, as well as to provide sail training experience to those trainees. And on the way up to Porbandar, one of the engines had given problem, so we had shut it down. And when we were coming back, I just cast off from Karwar Harbour and we were heading towards Bangalore en route to Kochi when my second engine also packed up. So there was nothing much to do except you hope like hell that you get good winds, and we got good winds. So I made a report to my headquarters and I spoke to the chief of staff in CNC and saying that we will sail back to Cochin. I expect to get good winds, and of course there was concern on the other side. So they did sail other ships, but they were at a far respectable distance, and we were allowed to make good our own passage, all under sails. And it so happened that en route for about 20 hours, there was no wind, so ship was becalmed, and that's a very unsettling thing to do when you know that you have to reach on time and there's very little you can do. You have no engines and you have no winds. So, as a last resort, what we did was that we just lowered our two small boats. We call them Gemini boats, which have got outboard motor engines. We lowered them and we passed ship's head ropes, one on the starboard bow and one on the port bow, and we asked our boats to, start towing the ship. This was a very unconventional method, but I remember having read about it in some of the old Royal Navy books that in the olden days, from Portsmouth, when the ships used to go out, they used to use ship's cutters, and the men used to actually, row those boats to tow the ship out of harbor. And once they were out, 4 or 5 miles out, and they will catch the normal winds, and that is how the ships will sail out and thereafter deploy their canvas, deploy the sails, and continue sailing on. So, well, that's what we tried in those desperate situations. And I must tell you happily, Adi, that for about 10 hours experiment that we did, we got about 25 miles passage we covered, which helped us shorten the distance. And on the third day, when we finally reached off Kochi, I dropped my hook. I just turned the ship around, lowered all the canvas, dropped the speed, and I dropped my anchor just outside Cochin Harbour. And thereafter, I gave a call to the CNC saying that the ship is back, and now we will be allowed to come inside with the help of tucks. So this is high experience, high adventure seamanship, which perhaps is only available to you on a sailing ship. It doesn't happen on every other ship. So there are many more memories. There are many more memories. In fact, it was such a pleasure to be able to host so many receptions on behalf of the Navy and the nation in foreign ports. We had many ambassadors and high commissioners who were, of course, co-hosts with us. But There were visitors like the service chiefs, the navy chiefs. We had the French navy chief, who was a naval aviator, and it was such a pleasure interacting with him. I myself being a naval aviator, and then in Germany we had the German navy chief who was a submariner, and so there were people of such stature. There was there were generals from various armies who came around, and everybody was very intrigued to see a Indian sail training ship in foreign waters, which was something of a great novelty for them.
Just listening to that story of Kochi and the region there is quite harrowing enough. I think just lying still in the water is not something which would be quite easy to digest for a lot of people, and I guess it just takes a lot of grit to kind of hold that and take it forward. Amazing. So I must ask you a closing question, sir. So do you still sail as a pastime or as a hobby, or and do you plan to do something like that in the future? And do you know of any more further adventures that the Indian Navy is taking up of this sort, sir?
Well, Adi, I must say that Navy keeps undertaking these kind of long distance voyages of INS Tarangini and INS Sudarshini quite often. I think it's every second or third year Navy plans to send them to long distance voyages. And as far as my sailing is concerned, unfortunately, we don't have sea in Dehradun. We don't even have any large lakes here, for that matter. So whenever I happen to go across to our old naval establishments, it will be my endeavor to, take some time out. And of course, every naval station has a sailing club. That is where the Navy really inculcates this good practice of sailing in its officers and cadets and men. And some of the finest sailors have actually risen up from these small boats, which are the enterprise class. And this talk will be quite incomplete if I do not talk about the feats of Abhilash Tommy. Commander Abhilash Tommy, who also was a naval aviator, he started off sailing from sailing club in Kochi. And in the just 2 months ago, he's very successfully stood second in the in the global race, which is called the Golden Globe race, which is solo sailing non-stop, and it has taken him I think 238 days at sea to sail on that small little yacht, which is a two-masted yacht, Bayanath, and that has really made history. So I really wish to say that the Navy takes extreme interest in promoting sailing amongst its community for both officers, cadets, and sailors. And this is something which I think, as I mentioned to you earlier, it sets the bedrock for becoming a good naval officer, and you can build and develop all good qualities and abilities on the sailing skills.
Thank you for mentioning him, sir. I mean, it's quite a wonder that a person can do that by himself across the world. Uh, you really need some courage, and I think a lot of that courage comes through experience and training, and the kind of regimentation that goes through with regards to the basic upbringing within the Indian Armed Forces, in any force, and especially in the Navy when you're talking about sailing and being a part of the ocean. And I'm saying being a part of the ocean very specifically because you can't fight the ocean, so you have to be a part of it to sail forward. And that's something I hope you agree with me. Sir, thank you so much for this particular journey. It's not really a geopolitical angle. It's a story that, of course, needs to be told to the people who are interested, people who are looking for adventures in the Indian Navy. There's lots to have, and of course, a story where the Indian Navy is there all across the world, showing its presence. So, thank you for that, sir, and I hope look forward to having you on the show once again very shortly with another interesting subject. Till then, Jai Hind.
Thank you, Adi. Pleasure to have been speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.